In this unit, we discuss food safety and food technology. We're going to look both at what sorts of things do we do to protect our food supply, both on a national level and also just at home, some things we can do to make sure our food supply is safe. And we'll also look at some of the major culprits that cause foodborne illness in our food supply. Let's see here. Oops. When we look at how we monitor our food supply, there are literally a couple dozen different agencies within the government that in some way, shape, or form actually do touch our food supply, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. There's a lot of redundancy in covering our food supply, but it does make for a very splintered look at our food supply. There's agencies that monitor international food trade. There's agencies that cover offshore sea fishing. So there's a lot of different agencies that do touch our food supply and do help with monitoring our food supply in some way, shape, or form. So again, that can be a good thing because it does cover us with redundancy, but it also does allow for some things to slip through the cracks. These are the biggies, though, when you look at the agencies the most involved in our food supply: the CDC, the EPA, World Health Organization, FDA, and USDA. These are the ones you probably hear the most about and the ones that have the greatest impact on our food supply, especially the FDA and the USDA. Without a doubt, they have the biggest roles in our food supply, and I'll get to those in just a minute. But first, to touch on some of these other ones, the CDC stands for Centers for Disease Control, and the CDC, based out of Atlanta, is a government agency that looks at the spread of all diseases, not just the foodborne illnesses, but without a doubt, if there is a disease being caused by some sort of food contaminant or some sort of outbreak of some bacteria through food, the CDC will monitor that. And they look more specifically at where is that outbreak occurring to try and track down. Is it coming from a certain processing plant? Is it coming from a certain restaurant? Is it coming from some food that was shipped in from overseas? So they study the spread of the foodborne illness to try and stave it off and how it's being spread. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, their job is to regulate mainly the use of pesticides and water quality. Obviously, they have, again, a larger role than just that aspect of the food supply. They help with conservation of forests and lakes and rivers. So they really are, they're designed, just like their name says, to protect the environment. But that does indirectly affect our food supply because they do look at pesticide use in farms and in how we treat our water quality as well. A World Health Organization, they're an international agency that does a lot of similar things to what the EPA does on the national level. They look at how pesticides are used internationally, what sorts of things are happening to the food supplies through that pesticide use, and also any side effects of that on the populations. Again, the two biggies, FDA and USDA. FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. They regulate both the food and the drug industry. So when it comes to food, they basically monitor genetically modified foods, additives, different preservatives that might be put into foods. So if a food company wants to add something artificially to their food, if there's some sort of new additive that they've designed, they have to get that approved through the Food and Drug Administration. Food and Drug Administration also, its larger role probably is with the drug industry. Any sort of medication or any sort of treatment, Prozac, Cialis, you see all the advertisements on TVs for these different drugs. FDA has to approve of those. So clinical trials are run through the FDA. They have to meet certain guidelines and standards before they can put those drugs out onto the market. USDA, this is the big one. You probably hear of them the most. They're the guys that are responsible for inspecting butcher houses, for inspecting poultry plants, mainly meat, dairy, eggs. They're the ones that inspect the different food sources for those things. They also will do some in grocery stores and things like that as well. They're responsible for different educational programs. They run WIC, which is a subsidy program for women, infants, and children. So they're responsible for quite a bit of monitoring our food supply, but they're mainly known for the dairy, the poultry, the eggs, the meat, and then FDA again also plays a role too. So focus on the roles of FDA and USDA. Those are the ones that in nutrition you're going to see play the greatest role in in monitoring our food supply and monitoring our health. How we define a foodborne illness. We commonly call it food poisoning, and it can be transmitted through either food or water. It's caused by some sort of infectious agent or some sort of poisonous substance. So a foodborne infection refers to the infectious agent. The poisonous substance that they release, lots of them release different toxins. We call that a food intoxication. You've probably heard that term before when we talk about drinking alcohol. If you have too much alcohol in your system, you can become intoxicated. It's really like a poison to your system. Bacteria, they can release different substances that can literally be toxic to your body or poisonous to your body, and we refer to that as a food intoxication. Really, the episodes far outnumber any other kind of food contamination. When we have food poisoning, we see this in about 76 million people a year. That number is a little hard to nail down because a lot of times people will have a foodborne illness, but they won't necessarily know what it is. They might think they've got a touch of the flu or something like that, but it probably came from some sort of food infection or food illness. So by far and away, you see a huge number of foodborne illness in a year, but only about 5,000 people actually die from foodborne illness in a year. So that's good to see that it's not that commonly a cause of death. And usually the people that do die from it are already immunocompromised. It usually affects the really old, the really young, those who already have other health conditions, or like I said, they're immunocompromised. Symptoms can range from just feeling like you have a little touch of the flu to chronic illness and even death, like I mentioned. If you think you might have a foodborne illness and it doesn't clear up within 3 days or so, oops, got an apostrophe there, you can ignore that. Oops, and I clicked ahead. Usually foodborne illness, it can make you deathly ill for a day or two while your body is trying to clean it out. But if it lasts more than 3 days, you really should go see a doctor. And if your fever is longer than 24 hours as well, and it's not breaking, you should see a doctor. If you start having really bad muscle stiffness or fever, muscle weakness, tingling sensations, fainting, dizziness, those are some pretty severe symptoms that you might need to go see a doctor. Also bloody stools too. Those things are not a good sign. That's a sign that you might need to get further medical treatment. But usually symptoms of foodborne illness, usually for millions of people, clear up within a day or two. Lots of times people just have vomiting and some severe diarrhea to kind of clean that out. But if it lasts longer than 3 days, you really should go in and get checked out. So how do microbes actually cause these illnesses? Well, there's a couple ways that microbes make us sick. First of all, when a microbe gets inside your body, remember that it's competing for your resources. So when it gets into your body, it will colonize a certain area of your body. It will multiply in those tissues, and then it's going to compete with those tissues for nutrients and oxygen, and then it's going to create its own waste. It's going to give off carbon dioxide. It's going to give off waste products, and so it makes us sick by first taking our nutrients or our resources, but then also it can make us sick by producing some of these toxic substances. Some of their waste products or just some of their just general byproducts are poisonous to us, and it can make us sick. And we classify those intoxications by what area of the body they make sick. So enterotoxins, these are toxins that poison our membranes and our intestines. Entero refers to intestines. Neurotoxins, these are poisons that act upon our nervous system or our nerve cells. So they'll actually be classified based on the region of the body or the tissue in the body that they actually intoxicate. Some of the more common culprits, I've listed the bacteria first because the most common cause of foodborne illness by far and away are different bacterial agents. Bacteria are the ones most likely to make us sick, and these are the most common ones that you'll see or that you've heard of. Staphylococcus aureus, it's the most common source of food toxicity, and it's scary because it's becoming very resistant to antibiotics. A lot of you may have heard of something called MRSA. It's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is commonly being seen now in hospital settings where the Staph aureus is building up resistance to our most common antibiotics that we use to treat it. So it's getting very, very hard to kill. We see it spread in our food supply. It's a common bacteria that exists really on our skin and in our nasal passages. So we all carry Staph aureus on our body. But if it gets into our food supply, especially the resistant strains of it, it can make us very, very sick. Clostridium botulinum, this one is probably the most infamous source of food toxicity because botulism is one that's very well heard of throughout history, actually. Botulism is a food intoxicant that that paralyzes your muscles. It produces a neurotoxin that makes your muscles weak and paralyzes your ability to use them. So if you get botulism poisoning, it can kill you. You can suffer the effects of it for months or even years with muscle paralysis. This actually, the toxin is isolated from Clostridium and used in Botox procedures. A lot of you have probably heard of Botox before, and that's people literally injecting the toxin into their forehead to prevent them from wrinkling their brow and causing wrinkles in their forehead. So people they're not injecting the bacteria in their forehead, but they're injecting the toxin from that bacteria to stop them from wrinkling their brow. So all the crazy things we do tie back to this very deadly bacteria. So that's where botulism comes from. One thing about botulism that's unique is it doesn't need oxygen. It can grow under anaerobic conditions. So when you have a dented can, you think it might be safe, but if there was a hole in that can and bacteria got in, it doesn't need exposure to oxygen to grow. So it can be fomenting inside that can forever and ever and ever, growing and enjoying the sweets inside that can, and you might not even know it, and then you use it. So that's why they recommend not using dented cans. If a can's been damaged, you should throw it away. Another thing to note about Clostridium is that it's common in unpasteurized honey. A lot of people will buy organic honey or unpasteurized honey, and Clostridium can grow very well in that honey. Again, if it's inside the honey, it doesn't need oxygen to grow. And so this is why they'll recommend to not give babies honey. A lot of moms used to, dip a pacifier in a little honey to get their baby to start suckling on it. Well, you should not do that. Babies and infants should not get honey for this reason, because they could get Clostridium as a bacterial infection. You could give your baby botulism if you give them unpasteurized honey. Some other culprits: E. coli, Escherichia coli. A lot of people have heard of E. coli. Very common in food illness outbreaks in restaurants when people aren't washing their hands. And this is because E. coli is so common in our fecal matter. So if people are going to the bathroom and not washing their hands in their food prep, they can contaminate you with it. So yuck, that's disgusting, but that is the truth. Listeria, salmonella, these are also bacteria that we see. We tend to see listeria more in unpasteurized dairy products. There was, not that many years ago, an outbreak of listeria on the surfaces of cantaloupe. So the cantaloupes were all being taken out of the grocery store. So every once in a while you can see it on fruits and vegetables too. Salmonella is a common bacteria that we see on raw or undercooked eggs. All chickens have salmonella. They all carry it, they all have it. And really you can find it on just about any surface of any egg. It's just that if it's there in massive quantities, it can cause you to get ill. So with all of these, symptoms are very similar. Nausea, headache, cramping, diarrhea, all common symptoms of having these bacterial infections. A couple notable non-bacterial agents: hepatitis. Hepatitis is a virus. There's lots of different strains of hepatitis. There's hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. I think it's all the way down to F or G now. Lots of different strains. But the most common that contaminates our food is Hep A. We see it in raw seafood, but also in unwashed veggies. It can travel through sewers. So lots of times you'll see it. There's been some outbreaks of hepatitis infection from onions, like on chives on potatoes in restaurants, if they come from, there was a case not that long ago where in Mexico they found an outbreak of hepatitis on a farm on their vegetables. They had a open sewer system running next to the vegetables, the rows of vegetables, and they found it had been contaminated by hepatitis. So that's no good. And then bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or also called encephalitis, BSE, a lot of people know this as mad cow's disease. Very, very dangerous infection. Thank goodness it's extremely rare. It's caused by something called a prion. A prion is not a virus. It's not a bacteria. It's actually just a protein particle. And if you eat meat that has it, it can get lodged in your brain and your central nervous system. So it gets transferred around by eating infected meat. And we've seen there was an outbreak, oh gosh, I think it was back, I'm going to date myself here, I think it was in the early 90s out in Great Britain. Some cows had it in Great Britain. Some of you might remember Oprah Winfrey got sued when she just said, oh, I'm never going to eat another hamburger again. She got sued by the beef industry because cattle prices plummeted. That might be on some of your radar if you're a little older like me. Remember that, because it is such a scary, scary disease. It's not a living thing, so it doesn't play by the same rules as other living organisms, and that is what makes it so tough to destroy, because you can't technically kill it. If you find a case of it, you literally will slaughter the whole herd because it's so hard to control. And the only way to actually get rid of prions is to actually incinerate the animals. There's no other way to completely make sure prions are gone. So very, very scary disease. And if you get this disease, there's no cure, there's no treatment. You will die from it. It'll cause symptoms of like Alzheimer's and dementia, and eventually you lose all neuromuscular control and die. So again, it's very, very rare, but every once in a while you do hear of a couple of cases here or there. So, so farmers are always watching for this. But again, not something to typically worry about. So where are the greatest chances of getting a foodborne illness? Where are the greatest risks, and what are the biggest reasons for it? Without a doubt, by far and away, the most common site of contamination is your own home. Second is a restaurant, but in your own home is where you're most likely to get contamination. So take heart, people who fear eating out or wonder what those grocery stores are doing to their meat. Most likely, if you get sick from a foodborne illness, you did it to yourself. You most likely did it at home. It's people not treating their own food supply right or storing it properly at home. The most common pathogen that we see is bacteria. By far and away, it's bacteria that are most likely to cause foodborne illness. And what's the most common reason for the success of those bacteria is improper maintenance of temperatures. If you don't keep hot foods hot and cold foods cold, that gives bacteria an opportunity to grow and thrive and flourish, and that's what makes you sick. Every time you consume food, you're consuming some bacteria with that food. I mean, there's no food that's completely sterile. But if you haven't kept it at the proper temperature before eating it, they may have had a chance to grow, and that's what makes you sick. So again, why is temperature so important? The bacteria that infect you, they infect you for a reason. They like your body temperature. So it's comfortable for them to be at 98.6. So we need to make it hot or cold to make it uncomfortable for them so they don't survive or they don't thrive. They grow at a rate that is super fast. I mean, what do humans have? We have a generation time of what? We live for 70 years. You know, lots of us reproduce sometime between the ages of 16 and 45 years. We only reproduce maybe a few times. You don't see a lot of families of 5 or 6 kids anymore. So we don't reproduce that fast, but bacteria, they grow at a crazy fast pace. They will reproduce and go from 1 cell to 2 cells, some cases every 15 to 20 minutes. There are a few that have generation times of 10 minutes. So if you think about it, humans reproduce on the scale of several decades. They do it on the scale of several minutes. So keeping them at improper temperatures, even just for a couple hours, can be a problem as far as foodborne illness goes. And if you look at, I'm not going to have this on the test, but I make my micro students do this. how do you calculate how many bacteria you actually could consume if you don't keep them at the right temperature? Number of bacteria at the end of the interval time is capital B. The number you start with is small b. And the number of generations is in the exponential position here on this equation. This will show you how many bacteria you can potentially consume. And I have an example here. So let's say my chicken salad sandwich has 20,000 salmonella bacteria, which really isn't that many, but I leave it in my nice warm car at 8 a.m. and I don't go to get it until noon. So I've let it sit in there for 4 hours. Well, if salmonella has a generation time of 20 minutes, how many bacteria did I eat? Well, their generation time of 20 minutes, I left them in there for 12 generations. Put that in the exponent spot and look at the number I get. I just went from potentially eating 20,000 salmonella to now I'm eating almost 82 million plus all their toxins. So the exponential effect of not keeping your food at the right temperature is very detrimental when it comes to foodborne illness. So let me see quick. How do we protect our food? What are the things that we do to protect our food supply? Well, first of all, when it comes to the primary places for our food sources, the farms and livestock yards, we have standards for space requirements for animals. A lot of animals are treated with different antibiotics that live in close quarters. They have high volume sewage treatment and water treatment facilities. They also will treat crops with different pesticide treatments, fungicides, bactericides. Side means to kill, so think like homicide means to kill people. Homo sapiens is our genus species name, so homicide or homicide refers to killing humans. So when you see fungicide, that means to kill a fungus, bactericide to kill a bacteria, and so forth. So we treat our crops with different pesticides and herbicides to kill unwanted organisms, and then we also treat our animals with antibiotics to keep them healthy. In processing plants, we specifically will dry grains and other products down to a certain moisture percentage to prevent spoilage or fungal growth. Meat and dairy, eggs, if you go to a processing plant, they have large freezers to keep things cold. And USDA, again, does a lot of on-site inspections to help keep the food supply safe. Other things, when you look at different companies and processing plants, they pasteurize food, they irradiate food, they use different packaging and wrapping, they add different preservatives. This is why eating so many processed foods can create a high sodium level in your body. A lot of different processing plants will use salt as their major preservative, which makes food last longer, gives it a longer shelf life, and reduces foodborne illness, but it also can mess with our blood pressure. Sodium's not good for blood pressure. It can increase your blood pressure over time. Grocery stores and restaurants, same thing. They have hot and cold maintenance in their restaurants. They have inspections on a yearly, sometimes even more common than that. Plastic wrappings, adherence to expiration dates. They have to do all those things in restaurants, or otherwise they can lose their license. I don't know that we always do that ourselves at home. We'll do the smell test, and that's not always a safe thing to do. But grocery stores and restaurants are held to a higher standard because they can lose their ability to sell their food if they don't pass their inspections. So when you look at the massive food industry that we have and all the checks and balances in place, we do a pretty good job as a society, really. We always got to keep that historical perspective in place. You know, the news media will sensationalize an outbreak that gets, 17 people sick. But by far and away, we have a very, very safe food supply. Historically, our food choices were much more limited. Food shelf life was much shorter. We didn't have mass production methods. We didn't have plastics. And we didn't have this kind of use once and dispose of mentality. Things were used and reused and not always clean. So foodborne illness was much more common back in the day. People didn't die from heart attacks and cancer. They died from dysentery, which is essentially diarrhea, infections that would spread and cause gangrene. So foodborne illness and infection greatly shortened our life expectancy back in the day. Food supply, food safety was a huge issue back then, and supplies were always questionable, and that contributed to a much shorter life expectancy. they never had to worry about dying from heart attacks or cancer because, even just a couple hundred years ago, if you made it to the age of 40 years old, that was considered old. So to live to 70 or 80 now has a lot to do with not only how we treat our food supply, but vaccinations, antibiotics, things like that. So our preservation methods today and the mass scale in which we preserve them has really contributed to a higher standard of living, without a doubt. Some safety techniques of the past, and a lot of these are still used today. Canning, a lot of people still can, and we do it on mass scale in factories and plants today. Basically, canning uses sugars or salts to destroy or slow microbial growth. Lots of our fruits and our jams, our veggies, they're canned, but we also can meats as well. Salting, making jerky or smoky meats, drying them, that inhibits bacterial growth. And then also fermentation processes. When we pickle our foods like cucumbers, beer, wine, all of those things, fermentation creates an acidic environment, and that's going to limit the growth of microorganisms. So it wasn't uncommon for children to drink beer and wine because it was a safer supply of fluid than water. So all of those methods are still used today in our food supply, but back in the day they were essential because their food supply was questionable, and so fermentation and pickling their foods is very important. So although we still employ a lot of those today, we do it more on a mass scale, and there's other things that we do as well to make sure our food supply is safe, employing those. Pasteurization, this is a process of heating foods to really high temperatures and then cooling them quickly under a vacuum seal. So when a jar is heated up and they have those little pop tops on them, once they're heated to a point that's killed all the microbes, they'll seal those jars, and when those jars cool down, that creates a vacuum which will suck down that pop top, and so you know that nothing has opened that seal since the last time it was really hot. So that's why we have those nice pop tops. Once they're popped, then you know that seal's been broken and been exposed to the environment. And so if it's been popped in the store, you can just reject it to be on the safe side, to know you're not going to contaminate yourself. Again, pasteurization has been used for about 150 years, ever since Louis Pasteur invented it. But it's used on a grander scale now with mass production in factories. Sterilizing our food supply. Generally, we don't sterilize our food supply, but sterilization is employed in treating the equipment that we use in processing our food. Machines like an autoclave are used to destroy all microbial life. Again, we don't generally sterilize our food because it can damage vitamin content. It can change the taste of food. But again, a lot of the equipment we use to handle our food or preparing jars and cans before adding the food item will sterilize those. And again, anytime you see the term aseptic technique or aseptic processing, that's a term used to describe any sort of processing that keeps food as clean and sterile as possible. So using plastics, disposable linings, soapy water, any of those things are considered aseptic processing and help keep our food supply safe. Other things, refrigerating and freezing. Back in the day before refrigerators, they used to have ice houses where they would cut ice from the rivers and then keep it in an ice house or keep it under moss out of the sun to try and keep cool environments in the summer. Now we have refrigerators, now we have freezers. Those things all help keep bacteria out of their normal temperature range so that they don't grow or they die. Irradiating foods, that's scary to a lot of people when they see irradiation. They think, oh my gosh, I'm going to get cancer. But really, you're irradiating the food, and then you eat the food. You're not actually irradiating yourself. So the irradiation's FDA and USDA approved. It does scare a lot of people when they hear that, but it's done to kill microbes that are on your food. Especially meat gets irradiated a lot to kill any microbes that might be growing on it when it's processed. But it is a safe process. Again, it's not like standing out in the sun and getting UV rays. It would be like your meat sitting out in the sun getting rays, and then you eat the meat. So your body can process any of that DNA damage. Food additives. Additives in general are done to preserve colors and flavors. Food additives generally are not preservatives. Preservatives are things that help prevent the food from spoiling, but additives are more of an aesthetic thing, and they're highly regulated by the FDA because in the past some of them have been found to be cancerous. So they are very highly regulated. And then other things we do, we have GMOs, we have genetically modified organisms that are resistant to certain chemicals or certain microbe infections. They have a longer shelf life and they're less risky because we don't use pesticides, but they're also controversial. Some people don't want genetically modified foods, but truthfully, all of our food has been genetically modified since, tens of thousands of years ago when we started farming. Anytime a farmer takes a seed that has been known to produce a better crop and selects for that seed, they're genetically modifying their crop. They're only planting the best seeds. Anytime a farmer has the best bull mate with a certain cow to produce the best offspring, that's artificial selection of genetics. So whether it's done inside of a lab or whether it's done out in the field, we've been genetically modifying what sorts of plants and livestock we raise since the beginning of time. It's just a lot more scary now because we're doing it on a larger scale and we're doing it much, much more rapidly. So people wonder, oh gosh, is this safe? And what are the long-term implications of that? And truthfully, we're not going to know that until more time passes. But genetically modified plants, we've been cross-pollinating plants to get certain results, for eons. It's just now we do it a lot faster because we can do it in the lab. Some things that I want you to know about how to treat your food at home. Your fridges are kept at 40 degrees. Your milk and your eggs and your meats in the refrigerator is about 40 degrees. That's about 4 degrees centigrade. Your freezers are kept at about -4 degrees Fahrenheit. You should really marinate and thaw all of your meats in the refrigerator. It's not recommended that you thaw them in warm water or that you thaw them on a counter because you can forget them and not know how long they've been sitting out at room temperature. So always thaw and marinate meats in the refrigerator. You should cook all of your raw meat products to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and you should hold them at 140 until you're ready to serve them to make sure that bacteria haven't had a chance to grow. And anytime you have a food that has an off smell or color, if you're not sure about it, throw it out, and you should adhere to expiration dates. And I know that this can be really confusing because some things have expiration dates and some things have best by dates. And best by dates are like, this product is best if you use it by this certain date. That doesn't necessarily mean it's expired. So more often than not, it's safe unless you see something growing on it or that you have a weird color or smell. But that can be tough too because certain things like blue cheese dressing, that has blue cheese has a mold growing in it, so it's supposed to smell kind of funky. So it can be difficult to use appearance to try and decide whether to keep a food. In general, you really shouldn't use appearance as a tool to keep something. If in doubt, throw it out. If it smells weird or you're not sure, throw it away. Adhere to those expiration dates because sometimes people will take a whiff of something and say, well, it smells okay, and they'll just eat it anyway. But you are taking on a certain level of risk then if you're eating something past the expiration date. Some other things with food prep, keep raw foods separate. Don't use the same cutting board for meats and veggies. Raw meats should not be used with raw vegetables, especially if you're not cooking those vegetables. Always wash your hands and counters with warm soapy water. Wash all fruits and vegetables well before preparing them. Don't prep your food if you don't feel well. It's kind of common sense, but we still sometimes do it. If you don't feel well, don't prep food for other people. And you can heat wet rags and sponges in the microwave to help kill them. Without a doubt, the number one thing you can do to stop the spread of infection is wash your hands. I will say it again because it's so important. Because it doesn't just apply to food prep, it applies to just any sort of illness. Wash your hands. You don't realize how much your hands touch in a day and all the surfaces that we touch that we share. From mouses and keyboards to keys and doorknobs. We're all touching the same things and then we touch our face and we're spreading germs like crazy. So the best thing you can do to prevent the spread of any disease or any illness is wash your hands. Remember that. Your hands are the filthiest place on your body. I know that's hard to believe, but you have a wider variety of microorganisms on your hand than you do in your groin area. Isn't that crazy? It's true though. So wash those hands because that's the best thing you can do to prevent the spread of any sort of infection. Just to touch on, I mentioned a little earlier about some of the food safety concerns. There's a lot of concerns with pesticide use. The buildup of those over time is highly monitored. A lot of people have concerns about injecting animals with growth hormone to make them produce more milk or grow faster. There's a concern that this is affecting development rates in children. And then, like I mentioned too, food additives, thickeners, stabilizers, color, texture, there's concerns there as well. And again, that's highly regulated. So these are issues, absolutely, no doubt about it. These are things to have concern about. Without a doubt, they have increased the mass production of our food supply and the general safety of our food supply. There's no way that we could have the massive food supply and the safety levels of our food supply as a nation if we did not have some of these things. That being said, there is no doubt some legitimate concern about the use of these things. So I recognize that those concerns are there. So I've given you some other options if you do have those personal concerns. Overall, though, take heart. The U.S. food supply is highly monitored and incredibly safe, and we have exponentially more food for options than we've ever had before in the history of mankind. So you can take heart that there isn't as much to worry about as a lot of that fear-mongering is going on out there. But if you do have concerns, if you're like, I don't want to eat genetically modified crops, or I don't want to eat pesticide-treated food, you're not alone. There's other people that share those concerns, and there are a lot of really good options that are coming out. There's organic foods, which don't use any sort of pesticides or chemical treatments, range-free chickens, grass-fed cattle. I actually have a neighbor who grows grass-fed cattle, and she just loves the meat. So she sells her grass-fed cattle. She has range-free chickens. So there are those options out there. Raw food, there are foods that are not pasteurized. Again, there is some risk with that, but some people do want to eat raw foods. These foods are more expensive due to their higher cost of production, but they are alternatives for those who desire them. And the more and more we see people that want these alternative options, that will help drive those prices down. Anytime there's more and more people feeding into that market, there'll be an increased volume of suppliers. And so the more suppliers we get and the higher volume we see of these types of foods, that should help to level the cost curve out a little bit. So again, take heart, the food supply is relatively safe, exponentially more food options than we've ever had, fewer disease deaths from foodborne illness. But for those of you with concerns, you do have some viable options of different types of food that you can consume.